Close your eyes and allow the day's burdens to gently lift. Feel yourself easing into the comforting embrace of your bed, your breathing settling, your mind beginning to drift. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey, traversing the dust of millennia to an epoch when the world was spectacularly reborn from the very waters of destruction. We journey back to ancient Sumer, to the enigmatic clay tablets that safeguard secrets murmured in the Earth's most ancient written language. Tonight, we shall peel back the layers of time to reveal what transpired immediately after the Great Deluge. Tonight, we will delve into the actions of the Anunnaki upon their return. Before we plunge into this profound past, if you're prepared to explore the mysteries of our oldest civilization, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the current time in your location. And as is customary with our presentations, while the accompanying visuals enrich the context, they are not essential for following along with the narrative. We deeply appreciate your continued support. Now prepare your mind. Let the echoes of the ancient world envelop you, and let us begin. The silence that descended after the cataclysmic flood must have been utterly absolute, profound and deafening in its scope. Imagine such a scene. An entire world scoured clean, its canvas reset. The magnificent cities that had stood proudly for millennia, testaments to human ingenuity, were now nothing more than silt and fading memory. The monumental ziggurat of Eridu, a stepped pyramid once reaching majestically toward the heavens, lay toppled and broken, reduced to mere rubble. The vital canals that had once channeled life-giving water to the arid desert were now choked solid with debris. The fertile fields that had sustained tens of thousands were buried deep beneath suffocating layers of mud. The bustling markets, the sacred temples, the humble homes where families had laughed, argued, and simply lived, all of it was irrevocably gone, swallowed whole by the waters that had surged both from below and from above. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions, a devastating curse that had all but erased nearly everything humanity had painstakingly built. Yet, according to the Sumerian tablets unearthed from the ruins of ancient Nippur and other sites scattered across Mesopotamia, this wasn't merely a myth recounted around campfires. This was a vivid, traumatic memory. The Eridu Genesis, meticulously inscribed in cuneiform script around 1,600 years before the Common Era, recounts that the flood endured for 7 days and 7 nights. 7 relentless days of howling winds and torrential rain. 7 terrifying nights witnessing the world's slow, agonizing submersion. And when the tempest finally abated, when the sun at last pierced through the clouds to illuminate the vast devastation, what solitary trace of life remained? A single boat, an immense vessel carefully sealed with bitumen, adrift upon the boundless waters that now stretched to every horizon. Inside was a man named Ziusudra. In the subsequent Akkadian versions of the epic, he would be known as Utnapishtim. In the biblical tradition, he would later become Noah. But in the most ancient telling, the Sumerian original, his name was Ziusudra, a name profound with meaning, he who saw life, or he who lengthened the days of life. He was the final king of the city of Shuruppak, and for one brief, terrifying moment, he was quite literally the last man left on earth. The ancient tablet recounts that Ziusudra cautiously opened a window of his colossal boat, peering out at the transformed world. The hero king, in a gesture of profound reverence, prostrated himself before Utu, the venerable sun god. He then proceeded to offer sacrifices, and the fragrant smoke ascended into the newly cleansed sky. Drawn by this offering, the gods, who had themselves fled to the highest heavens to escape the deluge, now descended. They gathered eagerly around the sweet-smelling smoke, described by the text as swarming like flies, because they were utterly starving. For 7 long days, the gods had received no offerings. Their grand temples were obliterated, their magnificent cities were gone, and most critically, their worshippers, the very humans they had created, were wiped away. These humans, engineered as workers to tend the earth and provide sustenance to the divine, had vanished. The decision to destroy humanity, made in a fit of rage by the god Enlil, who had been unable to sleep through the incessant noise of burgeoning civilization, had worked all too effectively. But now, in the desolate aftermath, standing on the muddy, transformed shores of a world reborn, the Anunnaki confronted a momentous choice. They could have simply abandoned this grand experiment with humanity altogether. They possessed the option to retreat to wherever they originated from, whether that was the enigmatic planet Nibiru, as tantalizingly suggested by fringe theorists, or simply the ethereal cosmic realm of the gods, as widely believed by mainstream scholars. Alternatively, they could choose to begin anew, to rebuild from the ground up. And according to the unambiguous record of the tablets, that is precisely the path they ultimately decided to pursue. The Sumerian King List, an invaluable ancient document meticulously preserved on clay prisms and tablets, records what transpired next with remarkable, almost stark, specificity. It declares bluntly and without any dramatic flourish. Then the flood swept over. Following this cataclysmic event, when kingship was once again lowered from heaven, Its seat was now established in Kish. Notably, it was not in Eridu, the venerable first city. The cosmic reset button, it seemed, had been decisively pressed. And when civilization was rebooted, it did so in an entirely new geographical and political location. Power had undeniably shifted. The old world, as it was known, had perished. Yet, the Anunnaki were far from finished with humanity. In fact, their intricate work was only just commencing. To truly grasp the motivations behind the Anunnaki's actions after the flood, we must first delve into what the tablets reveal about their objectives before it. This is emphatically not a heartwarming tale of benevolent creators tenderly watching over their children with loving eyes. The Sumerian texts are remarkably, almost brutally, clear and unsentimental about the fundamental nature of the relationship between gods and humans. Humanity, in this ancient worldview, was emphatically not created out of divine love or affection. Humanity was created, purely and simply, to labor. The Atrahasis epic, recognized as one of the most comprehensive accounts detailing both the creation of humans and the cataclysmic flood that nearly annihilated them, does not, surprisingly, begin with humanity at all. Instead, it opens with a dramatic labor dispute among the gods themselves. The ancient text vividly describes how the great Anunnaki, the senior and ruling deities, had effectively enslaved the lesser gods, known as the Igigi. These junior gods were coerced into arduous toil, digging the vast rivers, dredging intricate canals, and even constructing mountains. For 40 years, the weary Igigi toiled without respite. And then, in a scene that would undoubtedly resonate with any modern union organizer, they erupted in revolt. They defiantly burned their tools, they surrounded the very house of Enlil, the formidable commander of all Earth operations, and they unequivocally refused to work another single day. The solution put forth by Enki, the cunning and insightful god of wisdom and water, was both brilliantly ingenious and chillingly pragmatic. He proposed the creation of an entirely new, replacement workforce. A primitive worker, a being endowed with just enough intelligence to comprehend and follow instructions, yet crucially, not intelligent enough to question their divine masters. This new species was fashioned using the genetic material, described as the intelligence or essence, from a slain god named Geshtu-e, carefully mixed with the clay of the earth. This divine human amalgam was then implanted into the wombs of goddess surrogates, and from this process, the very first humans were born, the Lulu Amalu, often translated as mixed ones or primitive workers. Our purpose in this stark creation narrative was unambiguous. We were engineered to serve, to dig vast irrigation canals, to cultivate the fields, to tend the livestock, and, most significantly, according to the tablets, to mine gold. The fringe theory, famously popularized by researcher Zecharia Sitchin, posits that this gold was vitally needed to repair the deteriorating atmosphere of the Anunnaki's home planet. Mainstream scholars, however, largely dismiss this interpretation as pure speculation, emphasizing that the ancient texts consistently refer to gold simply as a precious commodity, a powerful symbol of divine wealth and unparalleled power. Regardless of the specific purpose, the tablets are unequivocally clear on one point. Humanity's fundamental purpose was labor. Our very existence was utilitarian, our design pragmatic. We were, in essence, biological machines, meticulously engineered for a specific, demanding task. And we excelled at it, perhaps too well. The ancient texts vividly describe how humanity multiplied rapidly, spreading across the land and flourishing. We began to construct cities of our own, intricate and bustling centers of activity. In doing so, we also became incredibly noisy. This particular detail is a recurring theme within Mesopotamian flood narratives, one that modern readers often find to be darkly, almost absurdly, funny. The immense catastrophe, the near extinction of the entire human race, did not, in this original telling, occur because we were inherently wicked or morally corrupt, although later traditions would indeed introduce such moral failings into the narrative. The original Sumerian version of the story presents a reason far more mundane, and perhaps for that very reason, far more unsettling. Enlil desired to destroy humanity simply because we were too loud. Our incessant clamor disturbed his divine sleep. As the Atrahasis tablet grimly records, 1,200 years had not yet passed. By this time, when the land extended and the peoples multiplied, the land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. And so, with cold resolve, he made his decision. Wipe them out. Start over. Impose silence on the earth. But Enki, the very deity who had first mixed the clay and divine essence to spark humanity into being, found himself unable to countenance the utter destruction of his own creation. Thus, he journeyed to the reed wall of a humble house in the city of Shuruppak. He could not speak directly to the man within, for he was bound by a solemn oath of secrecy sworn to the council of gods. Instead, he whispered his urgent message to the wall itself, knowing full well that Ziusadra was keenly listening on the other side. He imparted to Zayusadra the precise dimensions of a massive boat, instructing him to meticulously seal it with bitumen. He then commanded him to bring aboard his family and the seed of all living creatures. Having delivered his clandestine warning, Enki returned to the heavens, and then the cataclysmic storm descended. For 7 days and 7 nights the world was consumed. So terrifying was its fury that even the younger gods fled to the highest heaven, cowering there like dogs. It seems that even Enlil's unbridled wrath unleashed forces so immense that they terrified the divine beings themselves. The cosmic forces of chaos, once unleashed, threatened to unmake not merely humanity, but the very ordered world that the Anunnaki had so painstakingly established. When the tempest finally subsided, and Zayusadra's boat came to rest upon the newly emerged land, he opened a window and offered his sacrifices. The gods, drawn by the rising smoke, gathered around it, not in triumph or celebration, but with palpable relief and gnawing hunger. In their zealous attempt to destroy humanity, they had come perilously close to destroying themselves. It was at this critical juncture, in the stark aftermath of their own cosmic tantrum, that the Anunnaki were compelled to make a new, profound decision. Enlil, still consumed by fury, was enraged that any human had managed to survive. But Enki, ever the advocate for his creation, argued passionately before the divine council. Humanity, he contended, should indeed be allowed to continue. However, there would be new rules, new systems of control, and innovative methods of population management strategies that would not necessitate the wholesale drowning of the entire world. The ancient text subtly hints at agents such as famines, diseases, and predators. Natural checks that would keep human numbers in balance without requiring divine intervention on such a devastatingly catastrophic scale. The gods, it seems, had learned a harsh lesson from their mistake. Total annihilation proved to be too messy, too unpredictable, and far too risky. What they truly needed was not extinction, but precise, ongoing management. And so, the monumental project of rebuilding humanity and its civilization commenced. The Eridu Genesis tablet, despite being severely damaged, remarkably preserves a passage vividly describing the subsequent events. When the narrative resumes after the flood, it is the revered mother goddess Ninhursag, also sometimes known as Ninmah, who is speaking. She outlines her intention to bestow kingship and systematic organization upon humanity once again. The passage then proceeds to name the very first cities to be re-established after the deluge, and their sequence is profoundly significant. First came Eridu, the most ancient and sacred city, the revered home of Enki, the god of wisdom. Eridu was explicitly placed under his direct divine supervision. Archaeological excavations at the site of Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq have indeed confirmed Eridu as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in human history, with foundational layers dating back to at least 5,400 BCE. The site bears compelling evidence of repeated reconstruction, with temple structures built sequentially one atop another over thousands of years, gradually forming a tell, an artificial mound created by successive layers of human habitation. The excavations, initially undertaken by the British archaeologist John George Taylor in 1855 and subsequently by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd in the 1940s, brought to light a remarkable sequence. 18 superimposed temples at the site, each constructed directly upon the ruins of its predecessor. This compelling pattern of repeated destruction and rebuilding eloquently speaks to a history punctuated by recurring catastrophes, whether from devastating floods, fierce warfare, or environmental collapse. The earliest temples were rudimentary reed structures, yet over time, they gradually evolved into colossal mud-brick edifices, culminating in an unfinished ziggurat initiated by the ruler Amarsin around 2047 BCE. Eridu's profound significance transcended mere political or economic importance. It was deeply sacred. Eridu was widely revered as the primordial point where civilization itself began, where kingship was first believed to have descended from heaven. Following Eridu, the narrative lists Bad Tibra, then Larak, then Sapar, and finally Shuruppak, the very city from which Zayusadra himself had embarked on his great vessel. These 5 foundational cities, as the Eridu Genesis informs us, were not established as monetary systems driven by trade and currency, but rather as highly organized, distributive economies. Resources were carefully allocated from central authorities, implying a tightly planned system. In essence, these were planned economies, meticulously overseen by temple administrators who, in turn, were ultimately accountable to the gods themselves. This was demonstrably not a nascent form of democracy. It was unequivocally a divine bureaucracy. The tablets further indicate that each of these resurrected cities was placed under the specific protection of a particular deity. Eridu fittingly belonged to Enki. Bad Tibra was entrusted to the sun god Shamash. Larak fell under the purview of Pabilsag, a formidable warrior god. Sapar was also dedicated to Shamash, though some versions of the texts attribute it to the sun goddess. And Shuruppak was overseen by Sud, a revered grain goddess. The underlying message was unmistakably clear. Humanity would be permitted to rebuild, but only under strict, direct divine supervision. These cities were not, in truth, ours. They belonged to the gods. We were merely tenants, and the Anunnaki, after considerable deliberation, had opted not to permanently evict their unique creation. Yet, who would undertake the daily management of these newly reconstituted cities? The gods, by their very nature, could not be omnipresent. They required intermediaries, a designated human leadership class. And so, the tablets recount that kingship was lowered from heaven a second time. The Sumerian king list records this pivotal moment with the same austere, matter-of-fact tone it applies to all other entries. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The first post-flood king named was Gower, whose name is sometimes rendered as Gusher. He is credited with a reign of 1,200 years. Modern scholars immediately observe that these reign lengths, while still impossibly long by human biological standards, are nonetheless dramatically shorter than those attributed to the pre-flood kings. For instance, Alulim, the first king before the deluge, purportedly ruled for an astounding 28,800 years, and Alalgar for 36,000 years. But after the flood, we observe reign lengths measured in mere hundreds, rather than the preceding tens of thousands. This fascinating pattern of diminishing reign lengths persists through successive dynasties until, by the time we reach historically attested figures such as Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose reign is approximately dated to 2700 BCE, we encounter a stated rule of 126 years. While still extraordinarily long, this duration begins to approach the realm of the believable, particularly if we consider the possibility that these numbers might represent entire dynasties or eras rather than the lifespan of individual rulers. Mainstream historians often interpret this as compelling evidence that the king list functions as a mythological document that gradually, almost seamlessly transitions into actual historical record. The exceptionally long reigns, in this view, are symbolic, perhaps representing entire epics rather than single monarchs. However, fringe theorists, adhering to interpretations pioneered by Sitchin, perceive a different explanation. They propose a genetic dilution. They argue that the pre-flood kings were either Anunnaki themselves or direct Anunnaki-human hybrids, possessing drastically extended lifespans. After the deluge, with only pure humans surviving, safeguarded by Ziusadra, these new rulers would possess more normalish lifespans, though the king list still suggests they were considerably longer than our contemporary ones. Perhaps the revitalized post-flood world, with its purportedly cleaner environment and direct divine oversight, genuinely fostered greater longevity. Or perhaps, the numbers are simply inflated, embellished by scribes eager to glorify their rulers. We cannot, with absolute certainty, definitively know. What we do know with certainty from the tablets is that these post-flood kings were far from being mere symbolic figureheads. They were dynamic builders, skilled administrators, and devout priests. They served as the crucial interface between heaven and earth, burdened with immense responsibilities. Maintaining the sacred temples, meticulously organizing labor for vital public works, skillfully adjudicating disputes, and, perhaps most importantly of all, ensuring that the uninterrupted flow of offerings to the gods continued unabated. For this, according to the ancient texts, was humanity's fundamental primary function. We fed the gods through our sacrifices. Our smoke ascended, their favor descended, and thus the symbiotic cycle endured. However, the Anunnaki's rebuilding project after the flood was not exclusively focused on merely re-establishing cities and installing new kings. It encompassed something far more profound, the systematic transfer of knowledge. And this, precisely, is where the narrative becomes truly captivating, where the distinct line between mythology and something more tangible begins to blur in utterly unexpected ways. The Sumerians, tellingly, did not perceive their civilization as something they had painstakingly invented through human effort alone. Instead, they profoundly believed it was something that had been divinely bestowed upon them. Central to comprehending this ancient worldview is the concept of the me, often pronounced meh or me. The me were not merely abstract ideas. They were divine decrees, fundamental principles and powers that governed all aspects of civilization and cosmos. The texts astonishingly describe them as tangible physical objects, things that could be held, worn, transferred, or even, remarkably, stolen. There were said to be over 100 me, encompassing an incredibly vast array of domains, from the institutions of kingship and priesthood to the arts of writing and music, from the craft of metallurgy to the act of sexual intercourse, from the establishment of law and order to the forces of destruction and chaos. In Sumerian mythology, these me were originally safeguarded by Enki in his magnificent temple at Eridu, specifically stored within the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth where he resided. In one of the most famous myths, the formidable goddess Inanna, patron deity of the great city of Uruk, embarks on a journey to Eridu to visit Enki. There, she cleverly gets him thoroughly drunk on beer, and in his inebriated state, he impulsively bestows upon her more than 100 of the precious me. She promptly loads them onto her boat of heaven, and sails triumphantly back to Uruk. When Enki finally sobers up and realizes the magnitude of what he has done, he dispatches his loyal servants to pursue her and reclaim the me. But Inanna, with cunning and determination, successfully defends her invaluable cargo, ultimately bringing the sacred gifts of civilization to her burgeoning city. Mainstream scholars typically interpret this myth as a powerful political allegory, elucidating how Uruk eventually superseded Eridu to become the dominant city-state in southern Mesopotamia. The narrative, in this view, symbolizes the vital transfer of cultural and political power from the older, more ancient religious center in the south to a new, economically dynamic urban hub in the north. However, it is crucial to observe the profound underlying assumption embedded within the myth itself. Civilization, its writing systems, its laws, its advanced technologies, all of it originated from the gods, came directly from Enki. Humanity, according to this perspective, did not painstakingly invent these crucial elements through a long process of slow trial and error. Rather, they were deliberately bestowed upon us as essential tools to meticulously rebuild what had been so utterly lost. The post-flood world, as depicted in the tablets, witnessed a systematic and deliberate distribution of this divine knowledge. Enki, having previously saved humanity through Ziusadra's survival, now ensured that humanity possessed the means to sustain itself without requiring constant, direct divine intervention. He imparted the fundamental principles of agriculture, teaching them precisely which plants to domesticate, the techniques of plowing, how to effectively irrigate land, and how to safely store grain for lean times. The Sumerian text known as Instructions to a Farmer, preserved from the 16th century BCE but undoubtedly much older in its original form, reads astonishingly like a detailed technical manual. It meticulously describes, step by step, how to prepare fields, when to sow seeds, how to manage water resources, and how to properly harvest and thresh crops. This was not merely information. This was life-saving knowledge that literally meant the difference between cycles of feast and devastating famine. Enki's invaluable gifts, however, extended far beyond the realm of farming. The Sumerians profoundly credited him with teaching humanity the sacred art of writing itself. The earliest known forms of writing unearthed by archaeologists are the clay tokens and pictographs originating from Uruk, dating back to approximately 3400 BCE. These primitive marks initially served as simple accounting tools, rudimentary ways to meticulously track quantities of grain, livestock, and beer. Yet, astonishingly, within just a few centuries, this nascent system had rapidly evolved into true cuneiform, a sophisticated and complex script capable of recording not merely numbers, but intricate stories, comprehensive laws, heartfelt prayers, and detailed history. The sheer speed of this profound development is precisely what captivates the attention of alternative historians and theorists. To transition from virtually no writing to a system of complex literacy in a span of just a few hundred years begs the provocative question. Was this purely natural human innovation, an organic progression of ingenuity, or was it, as the Sumerians themselves profoundly believed, a direct, deliberate gift from the gods? Beyond language, the tablets also attribute to the Anunnaki the teaching of advanced mathematics. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, ingeniously based on the number 60, remains remarkably influential in our world today. We utilize its principles every time we consult a clock, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and every time we measure an angle in degrees, 360 degrees in a circle. This mathematical framework was sufficiently sophisticated to manage incredibly complex calculations, including intricate square roots and geometric progressions. Later Babylonian astronomical tablets, compiled centuries after the Sumerians but built directly upon their foundational mathematical principles, showcase calculations that enabled them to predict eclipses and meticulously track planetary movements with astonishing, almost uncanny, accuracy. From whence did such profound knowledge originate? The mainstream academic explanation suggests it developed gradually, painstakingly passed down and refined over countless generations of careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. However, the alternative theory poses a compelling and provocative question. If a technologically advanced civilization, whether an extraterrestrial one, as famously proposed by Sitchin, or simply a lost, highly evolved human civilization, as suggested by other researchers, wished to equip a recovering post-catastrophe society with the essential tools for rebuilding, what knowledge would they impart? They would undoubtedly provide practical, foundational knowledge. Agriculture for sustenance, mathematics for engineering and planning, writing for communication and record-keeping, sophisticated engineering principles, astronomy for tracking seasons and predicting floods, metallurgy for crafting vital tools, and a framework of law for maintaining social order. In other words, precisely the compendium of knowledge that the Sumerians themselves claimed the Anunnaki bestowed upon them. The enigmatic seven sages, known as the Apkallu, feature prominently and repeatedly in Mesopotamian tradition as the primordial teachers of humanity. These were depicted as semi-divine beings, often portrayed as fishmen or as men adorned in cloaks resembling fish skin, who emerged from the Abzu, from Enki's mysterious watery realm, specifically to instruct humans in the sophisticated arts of civilization. The foremost of these sages was named Adapa, sometimes referred to as Oannes, who served the first king of Eridu, Alulim, in the distant epoch before the Great Flood. Yet, the tradition maintained that these sages continued to appear even after the deluge, tirelessly working to ensure that vital knowledge was not irretrievably lost. Were these sages literal, physical beings? Were they, as some provocative theories suggest, the Anunnaki themselves, manifesting in physical forms to walk among humans as divine educators? Or were they simply exceptionally wise men, perhaps astute survivors of the old world who meticulously preserved and carried forward the memories and profound knowledge of the preceding age? The ancient texts leave this fascinating question tantalizingly unresolved. What they do emphasize, however, again and again, is that humanity's astonishingly rapid development was not solely a miracle of inherent human ingenuity. It was guided. It was taught. It was, within the Sumerian worldview, a direct continuation of the grand divine project that had first commenced when Enki ingeniously mixed clay and divine blood in his primordial laboratory. The rebuilt cities of post-flood Sumer were, by any standard, architectural marvels. At the heart of each re-established urban center stood a majestic ziggurat, a massive, stepped pyramid constructed from mud brick that profoundly dominated the surrounding landscape. These structures were not tombs, like the pyramids of Egypt. Rather, they were elaborate temples, and more specifically, they were perceived as divine homes, as sacred landing platforms, and as vital connection points between heaven and earth. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved examples, vividly conveys the immense scale of these constructions. Its base measured an impressive 210 by 150 feet, and it ascended in 3 grand terraces to a height of approximately 80 feet. At its very summit stood a hallowed shrine, believed to be the residence of the moon god Nana. The construction of these colossal ziggurats demanded immense resources and the application of highly sophisticated engineering principles. The sheer number of bricks required firing in kilns, consuming vast quantities of fuel. The towering structure had to be meticulously engineered for stability, despite being erected on soft, flood-prone alluvial soil. Elaborate drainage systems were painstakingly incorporated to prevent devastating water damage, and the entire edifice had to be constantly maintained, as the harsh environment of southern Mesopotamia, with its relentless seasonal floods and abrasive sandstorms, would swiftly erode any structure left untended. Intriguingly, some mainstream archaeologists now hypothesize that the regular, almost ritualistic maintenance and rebuilding of these temples, so thoroughly documented in the archaeological record, may in fact reflect not merely the effects of natural weathering but also repeated, catastrophic flood events that severely damaged these monumental structures. The tablets, with their characteristic clarity, tell us plainly that the building of these magnificent temples was not a human initiative or a spontaneous desire. It was, without question, a divine command. The gods themselves decreed their construction. Kings who sought to maintain their divine favor and secure their earthly legitimacy consistently rebuilt and expanded these sacred temples. They meticulously left behind inscriptions that detailed their pious endeavors, ensuring their devotion was publicly acknowledged and eternally recorded. A prime example is King Ur-Nammu of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, who reigned around 2100 BCE. He commissioned a stele depicting himself with builder's tools, personally participating in the construction of the ziggurat. Yet, the inscription makes it unequivocally clear. He undertook this colossal task not from personal ambition, but at the explicit command of the moon god Nana. The temple was not his concept. It was a divine instruction, and he merely acted as the obedient servant, carrying out the will of the heavens. A more unconventional, fringe interpretation diverges sharply from this view, seeing ziggurats not as symbolic or purely religious structures, but as highly functional ones. With their distinctive terrace platforms and summit shrines, these theorists suggest they bear a striking resemblance to modern launch facilities or communication towers. Were they, as ancient astronaut theorists propose, landing pads for the advanced craft of the Anunnaki? Were the summit shrines sophisticated control rooms or even refueling stations? The academic response to such propositions is consistently clear and grounded. There is simply no evidence to support this interpretation. Ziggurats, from a scholarly perspective, were unequivocally temples, the vibrant centers of religious and economic life. Their summit shrines were typically modest, small structures where priests conducted sacred rituals, presented offerings, and meticulously observed the heavens, aligning human affairs with cosmic patterns. They were emphatically not spaceports. Nevertheless, this alternative theory persists, largely because of a powerful theme emphasized within the tablets themselves. The gods did not remain in heaven after the Great Flood. They returned. They descended. They dwelt within their temples among humanity. Indeed, the Odeogenesis, or similar ancient flood narratives, explicitly state that after the deluge, the Anunnaki took up their residences among the people of Sumer. This was not a distant, hands-off governance, but a palpable, physical presence. If the Anunnaki were indeed physical beings, whether gods in the traditional sense or something else entirely, then they inherently required physical spaces, homes. And, as the texts tell us, they required precisely what the Sumerians diligently built for them. The intricate organization of post-flood Sumerian society is astonishingly well documented, preserved across thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. These aren't just myths or legends. They are concrete administrative records, Receipts, inventories, ration lists, employment contracts, legal judgments, the meticulous, everyday paperwork of a complex, functioning civilization. These records consistently reveal a society that was intensely hierarchical and deeply bureaucratic. At the apex of this societal structure stood the gods themselves. Their presence manifested on earth through their magnificent temples. Each temple was far more than a mere place of worship. It functioned as a powerful economic institution, often owning vast tracts of agricultural land, employing hundreds or even thousands of workers, storing immense quantities of grain and goods, issuing loans, and engaging in extensive trade networks. The Temple of Inanna in Uruk, for instance, was essentially a state within a state, complete with its own complex administration, dedicated workforce, and self-sustaining economy. Beneath the temples in this hierarchy were the kings, who simultaneously served as high priests and military leaders. Their responsibilities were immense and multifaceted, maintaining the vital irrigation systems that rendered agriculture possible in the arid desert, organizing formidable defensive walls against rival city-states, and, critically, ensuring that the gods received their full and proper due. A king who faltered in these sacred duties could anticipate swift divine retribution, typically manifesting as catastrophic military defeat or devastating natural disaster. Below the kings were the scribes and priests, the highly educated elite who possessed the invaluable skills of reading and writing, meticulously maintaining the empire's records and performing the complex religious rituals. Following them were the skilled craftsmen, the soldiers, the diligent farmers, and the general laborers. At the very bottom of this stratified society were the slaves, often prisoners of war or individuals who had sold themselves into bondage to discharge overwhelming debts. This was clearly not an egalitarian paradise. It was a rigidly stratified society with pronounced divisions of power and wealth. Yet, it was a system that worked, remarkably so. It generated sufficient surplus to support burgeoning cities of tens of thousands, built monumental structures that endured for millennia, and fostered the creation of literature that continues to be read and revered today. The tablets make it abundantly clear that this elaborate social structure was not considered a human innovation. It was once again divinely ordained. Kingship itself was understood to have descended from heaven. The laws governing society were handed down by the gods. Even the specific duties and roles of various professions were seen as integral components of the sacred principles and cosmic ordinances established at the very dawn of civilization. When the renowned lawgiver Hammurabi of Babylon, ruling around 1750 BCE, codified his celebrated legal system, he never claimed to have invented it. In the prologue to his laws, meticulously carved onto a towering black stone stele, he explicitly states that he was chosen by the great gods Anu and Enlil to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land. The laws, in his view, were not his own. They were divine, and he was merely their administrator, ensuring their proper application. This is the consistent pattern we observe throughout the post-flood tablets. Humanity was given a system. We were provided with the essential tools, the fundamental knowledge, and the intricate social structures necessary to forge a stable civilization. And we were given supervisors, the kings and priests who served as vital intermediaries, maintaining communication with the Anunnaki and ensuring that the divine will was diligently carried out. The initial experiment of humanity had nearly failed. The Great Flood had almost annihilated everything. But the Anunnaki, having resolved to grant humanity a second chance, evidently took no further risks. This time, they established tighter controls, implemented more direct oversight, mandated clear hierarchies, and ensured regular communication through elaborate temple rituals and oracles. And it undeniably worked. Post-flood Sumer flourished with unprecedented vigor. City-states prospered, growing wealthy through advanced agriculture and extensive trade routes. Scribal schools meticulously trained new generations of literate bureaucrats, ensuring the continuation of administrative precision. Artists created magnificent sculptures and intricate cylinder seals, testaments to their refined aesthetic. Poets composed powerful epics that delved into the most fundamental questions of human existence. Indeed, the Epic of Gilgamesh, widely recognized as the world's oldest surviving great work of literature, originates from this very period. It recounts Gilgamesh's profound quest for immortality after the devastating death of his beloved friend Enkidu, and his arduous journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who had been granted eternal life by the gods. Within that epic narrative, Utnapishtim himself recounts to Gilgamesh the harrowing tale of the deluge, thus ensuring that the indelible memory of that world-shattering catastrophe was meticulously preserved for future generations. For the Sumerian consciousness, the flood was not some distant, abstract ancient history. It was the definitive cataclysmic event that irrevocably separated the old world from the new. Everything that came after was post-flood, the age of diligent rebuilding, a period when humanity and the gods, however uneasily, collaborated to restore what had been so devastatingly lost. But as the centuries steadily unfolded, a subtle yet profound transformation began to take hold. Tablets from later periods reveal a gradual but significant shift. The gods, once so intimately present and deeply involved in the daily affairs of humanity, began a slow, inexorable withdrawal. They became increasingly distant. Direct appearances ceased. Clear, explicit instructions became remarkably rare. While kings continued to assert their divine authority, still meticulously performed the ancient rituals in their temples, and diligently made the prescribed offerings, the pervasive sense of an immediate, tangible divine presence gradually faded into memory. By the time we reached the Babylonian period roughly around 1800 BC.E., the very myths themselves visibly reflect this evolving change. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the god Marduk ascends to ultimate supremacy over the older Anunnaki pantheon. He triumphantly defeats the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat, fashions the cosmos from her slain body, and firmly establishes Babylon as the undisputed center of the world. The older gods, the Anunnaki, recede into the background, becoming venerated but less active figures. Marduk, a relatively young deity within the broader Mesopotamian pantheon, steps into the central focus. This theological shift profoundly mirrors the political reality of the era, as Babylon steadily gained dominance over the older, once powerful Sumerian city-states. But it also profoundly reflects a theological evolution. The ancient gods, the Anunnaki who had reputedly created humanity and survived the flood, were increasingly perceived as figures of the past, honored certainly but no longer direct, active participants in the day-to-day affairs of the world. So what ultimately became of them? The ancient texts do not explicitly state. They simply and intriguingly fade from the narrative. Some tablets subtly suggest they may have retired to their heavenly realm, perhaps satisfied that humanity had finally stabilized and no longer required such intensive, hands-on management. Other interpretations imply internal conflict among the gods themselves, possibly leading to a strategic withdrawal or a fundamental alteration in the divine hierarchy. The fringe theories, of course, offer their own compelling and imaginative explanations. Perhaps the Anunnaki returned to their home planet, Nibiru, as its immense 3,600-year orbit carried it back into the remote depths of space. Perhaps they ventured underground, establishing hidden bases from which they could observe humanity without direct interference. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, they never truly left at all, but simply ceased revealing themselves openly, choosing instead to guide from the shadows through select bloodlines and covert secret societies. What we do know with certainty from the wealth of archaeological evidence is that Sumerian civilization did not end abruptly in a cataclysmic collapse. Instead, it gradually evolved and was progressively absorbed by a succession of powerful empires. The Akkadians, under the legendary Sargon the Great, conquered the independent Sumerian city-states around 2334 BCE, forging what is often considered the first true empire in Mesopotamia. Yet, the Akkadians adopted Sumerian culture wholesale, continuing to utilize the Sumerian language for their religious texts and scholarly pursuits, even as Akkadian rose to become the dominant language of daily life. Later, the Babylonians emerged, then the Assyrians, followed by the Persians, and eventually Alexander the Great and the Greeks. Each successive empire meticulously built upon the foundations laid by its predecessors, carefully preserving and transmitting the profound knowledge and timeless stories of Sumer. The Sumerian language itself, recognized as the world's oldest written language, eventually ceased to be a spoken tongue. However, it persisted for thousands of years as a revered language of scholarship and religion. Much like Latin in medieval Europe, scribes in Babylon, long after Sumer had fallen into historical memory, still diligently learned to read the ancient tablets. They meticulously copied the old myths, the foundational story of the flood, the epic tale of the Anunnaki, the vivid memory of a time when gods purportedly walked the earth. These narratives were carefully kept alive, passed down, translated, and adapted, but never truly forgotten by the literate elite. And then, for a very long time, they were forgotten. The last cuneiform tablets were written in the 1st century of the Common Era. After that, the crucial ability to read the intricate wedge-shaped script was tragically lost to humanity. The tablets remained entombed beneath the sands and ruins of Mesopotamian cities for over 1,800 years, silently waiting in the dust for someone to rediscover and decipher them once more. When archaeologists finally succeeded in this monumental task, when George Smith, working at the British Museum, triumphantly translated the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872 and announced to the world that he had unearthed a version of Noah's flood narrative that predated the Bible by 1,000 years, it ignited a worldwide sensation. Here was irrefutable proof that the biblical stories possessed deeper, far older roots, drawing upon traditions that stretched back into the mists of prehistory. As more and more tablets were meticulously translated, and the full, breathtaking scope of Sumerian literature and history became unequivocally clear, scholars grasped the profound realization that they were gazing upon nothing less than the very foundation of Western civilization itself. But they were also confronting something profoundly stranger. They were examining texts that consistently and insistently claimed that humanity had been guided, that we had been taught, that our remarkably rapid ascent from humble Stone Age villages to sophisticated Bronze Age cities, complete with intricate writing, codified law, advanced mathematics, and sophisticated astronomy, was not entirely our own doing. The Sumerians themselves, the very people who famously created the world's first civilization, humbly did not claim sole credit for it. Instead, they unequivocally attributed their foundational achievements to the Anunnaki. How, then, are we to interpret this extraordinary claim? The mainstream academic view is lucid and firmly grounded in solid scholarly consensus. It posits that the Anunnaki were simply gods in the traditional religious sense. Powerful spiritual entities, personifications of natural forces and cosmic principles. The stories of creation, the devastating flood, the divine teaching of civilization. These were, in this view, compelling myths, humanity's earliest attempts to explain their world, its origins, and their place within its grand tapestry. The undeniably rapid development of Sumerian civilization was indeed remarkable, but it can be adequately explained by a confluence of favorable environmental conditions, the transformative invention of agriculture, the sophisticated development of irrigation systems, and, above all, the boundless ingenuity and remarkable adaptability of the human spirit. The Sumerians, like many ancient peoples, attributed their successes to divine intervention because that is precisely what humanity does. We create gods to explain what we do not yet understand. However, the alternative interpretation, famously popularized by Zecharia Sitchin and enthusiastically embraced by ancient astronaut theorists, offers a radically different reading. What if the Sumerians were not merely creating abstract myths? What if they were, to the very best of their ability, recording history as they experienced it, using the language and conceptual frameworks available to them at that nascent stage of human development? If a primitive people were to encounter highly advanced beings possessing technologies far beyond their comprehension, how would they describe them? Inevitably, they would call them gods. If those beings arrived in sophisticated flying craft, those craft would naturally become celestial boats or the chariots of the gods. If they demonstrated advanced knowledge in fields such as genetics, astronomy, and engineering, that knowledge would undoubtedly be perceived as divine wisdom. And if they actively aided humanity in rebuilding after a cataclysmic disaster, their actions would be remembered in precisely the way the tablets recount them. As gods coming down from heaven, re-establishing civilization, teaching humanity, and then eventually withdrawing. The truth, as is so often the case, most likely resides somewhere within the complex and nuanced middle ground. The tablets are not objective video recordings. They are not dispassionate historical documents in the modern sense. They are the deeply personal stories a culture carefully told itself, inevitably shaped by the prevailing theology, the shifting political landscapes, and the inherent limitations of human memory stretched across vast expanses of time. Yet, they are also not pure fiction or mere fantasy. They contain within them the distilled experiences, the profound fears, and the overwhelming awe of the people who painstakingly wrote them down. What we can state with absolute certainty is this. After some colossal catastrophe, whether a localized, devastating flood or a more widespread, ancient disaster, Sumerian civilization rebuilt itself with astonishing speed and unparalleled sophistication. Within just a few centuries of the distinctive flood layer discovered by archaeologists in the soil strata of Mesopotamian cities, dated to roughly 2900 BCE, we witnessed the full, vibrant flowering of urban civilization. Cities burgeoning with tens of thousands of inhabitants, complex and efficient irrigation systems, monumental architectural wonders, a highly sophisticated writing system, and advanced knowledge in mathematics and astronomy. This is clearly not the slow, arduous, grinding progress of a society painstakingly starting from scratch. This is a rapid, explosive development, strongly suggesting that fundamental knowledge and essential social structures were not irrevocably lost, but rather carefully preserved and efficiently transmitted. And the Sumerians themselves consistently insisted that they had received help. They insisted that what they painstakingly built, they built according to a divine plan. They insisted that their kings ruled by heavenly decree. They insisted that their laws, their rituals, their entire intricate social order originated from the gods themselves. Whether those gods were truly powerful spiritual entities, advanced extraterrestrial visitors, or perhaps even the fragmented, dimly remembered echoes of an earlier, highly advanced human civilization that ultimately fell and imparted its invaluable knowledge to the survivors, this is a question we cannot definitively answer. What we can definitively say is that the tablets, speaking in their own ancient voices, tell us precisely what happened after the flood. The Anunnaki returned. They surveyed the widespread devastation. They found Ziusadra and his family. They made a crucial decision not to abandon their grand experiment, but to continue it under new, more controlled conditions. They established new cities with Eridu rebuilt first and foremost as the sacred primary center. They lowered kingship from heaven, installing human intermediaries to diligently manage daily affairs. They meticulously distributed the divine gifts of civilization, ensuring that humanity possessed all the necessary tools and profound knowledge needed to thrive. They built grand new temples, which served as vital connection points between heaven and earth. And they oversaw the arduous, meticulous reconstruction of a world that had nearly been lost forever. For a time, perhaps for generations, perhaps for many centuries, this new, divinely orchestrated arrangement held. The gods purportedly dwelt among humanity. Kings directly consulted with them, seeking their counsel. Priests ventured into the innermost sanctums of the temples and emerged bearing divine messages. The system, for all intents and purposes, worked. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the gods began to withdraw. They left behind their magnificent temples, their meticulously codified laws, their sprawling cities, and their timeless stories. They bequeathed to humanity a comprehensive blueprint for civilization, a foundational design that would be copied, adapted, and built upon by virtually every culture that followed. And they left behind a lingering, profound question, preserved in hardened clay and etched in the oldest writing on earth. What truly were the Anunnaki? Who were they in their essence? And if they came once, if they created us, taught us, guided us, and then ultimately departed, will they ever return? The tablets, tellingly, do not answer this ultimate question. They conclude not with a definitive resolution, but with a profound silence. The gods simply fade from the historical record. Humanity, their creation or their experiment or their children, depending on how one interprets the ancient texts, is left to continue alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was always the larger plan. Perhaps the post-flood world, with its tighter controls and clearer hierarchies, was nothing less than a grand training ground. Humanity had proven itself remarkably capable of thriving under direct supervision. The crucial question that remained was whether we could truly thrive without it. And so, the Anunnaki, having imparted everything they deemed necessary, having established the intricate structures of civilization and ensured their capacity for self-perpetuation, gently withdrew. They did not abandon us entirely. They simply stepped back. They let go, and then they watched to see what we, their progeny, would ultimately do. But before we reach that enigmatic ending, before we arrive at the precise moment of divine withdrawal, we must linger longer in the vivid world they helped to build. We must walk, in our imagination, through the bustling streets of these post-flood cities. We must stand in the sacred temples where the profound rituals were meticulously performed. We must strive to understand, in intimate detail, what it truly meant to live in a civilization that believed, with absolute and unwavering certainty, that gods walked among them and demanded their daily service. Picture yourself now in the ancient city of Nippur, the undisputed religious heart of Sumer, circa 2500 BCE. The sun has not yet crested the horizon, but the city is already stirring with a gentle hum of awakening life. You stand outside the awe-inspiring great temple of Enlil, the Eker, whose very name translates majestically as mountain house. This is not merely a building in the human sense. It is, according to the unwavering belief of the Sumerians, the actual dwelling place of the god himself. The massive ziggurat looms before you, its towering mud brick sides beginning to catch the first pale, ethereal light of dawn. You can already detect the sweet, pungent aroma of incense, the fragrant myrrh and cedar smoke gracefully drifting down from its upper, sacred levels. Inside the sprawling temple complex, a world unto itself pulses with focused activity. The priests have been awake for hours, having risen long before the first hint of light. The chief priest, a figure of immense gravitas, meticulously clad in immaculate white linen, has already undergone a ritual bathing in sacred water drawn from the temple's deep well, water believed to connect directly to the Abzu, the primordial cosmic freshwater ocean hidden beneath the earth. He has anointed himself with precious oil, infused with the purifying scents of cypress and juniper. He has solemnly recited the ancient prayers of purification, each word delivered with an exactitude passed down through generations, taught to him by his father, who learned it from his father, stretching back in an unbroken, sacred chain to the epoch immediately following the flood, when kingship itself was lowered from heaven. Within the innermost sanctuary, the cella, the majestic statue of Enlil patiently waits. It is exquisitely carved from precious cedar wood, meticulously imported from distant Lebanon, and then lovingly overlaid with gleaming sheets of hammered gold. The eyes, strikingly inlaid with deep blue lapis lazuli from far-off Afghanistan, bestow upon the god a gaze that seems to penetrate directly into your very soul. The Sumerians believed the statue was not merely a symbol. It was not a representation. It was the god. Enlil's divine essence, his melam, his terrifying, radiant splendor, resided tangibly within this form. To gaze directly upon it unprepared was to risk being struck blind, your eyes seared by the sheer intensity of the divine presence. The awakening ritual solemnly begins. The chief priest approaches the sanctuary with slow, deliberate, measured steps, each movement laden with reverence. Behind him, a solemn line of junior priests follows, carrying trays laden with the morning offerings. The chief priest begins to chant the ancient, sacred words, his voice rising softly in the lingering pre-dawn darkness. Enlil, great mountain, father of the gods, whose word is destiny, whose utterance is unchangeable, who decrees the fates, rise from your rest. The land awaits your judgment. Your servants await your commands. He then carefully pulls back the heavy curtain that separates the god's sacred bedchamber from the outer sanctuary. The ancient ritual texts describe this precise moment with meticulous detail. The god has been sleeping. Like any great lord, he must be awakened gently, respectfully. The priests profoundly understood that to startle a god from slumber could unleash catastrophe upon the entire city. Thus, the awakening is a symphony of subtle reverence. With soft music, with gentle chanting, with the delicate tinkling of bronze bells. The statue is addressed as though it were a living person, just slowly opening its eyes to greet a new day. Once awakened, the god must be clothed. The priests reverently remove the previous day's garments, handling them with utmost sanctity, for they have absorbed the divine essence and must be treated as sacred objects. New, resplendent robes are brought forth, dyed in the deepest blues and purples, colors exclusively reserved for royalty and divinity. The fabric itself is Mesopotamian fine wool, meticulously woven by the temple's own dedicated weavers, women who have consecrated their entire lives to creating garments worthy of the gods. The chief priest and his assistants carefully dress the statue, adjusting each delicate fold, ensuring that the god is impeccably attired to receive visitors and conduct the weighty business of the day. Then comes the first meal, an elaborate affair comprising 2 courses, meticulously prepared in the temple kitchens by cooks who are themselves consecrated priests, trained in the sacred art of divine cuisine. Ancient texts from the city of Pusrishdagon, near Nippur, enumerate the astonishing provisions meticulously stored for the gods. The sheer quantities are staggering. Thousands of cattle, tens of thousands of sheep and goats, grain measured in tens of thousands of bushels, abundant dates, figs, honey, milk, cheese, and vast, flowing amounts of beer. Beer, in Sumer, was not simply a beverage. It was profoundly sacred, revered as a gift from the goddess Ninkasi, and it flowed like water at every ritual and festival. The morning meal is reverently laid before the statue on exquisite offering tables carved from pristine alabaster. Roasted meat, still steaming hot, sits alongside freshly baked bread made from the finest barley flour. Bowls of luscious fruit are arranged in perfect, symbolic geometric patterns. Jugs of beer and fresh milk are placed alongside plates of dates soaked in rich honey. Fragrant, crimson wine, imported from the distant highlands, completes the divine repast. As each dish is meticulously placed, the priests recite fervent prayers, thanking the god for his continued protection, imploring his blessings upon the vital crops, upon the fertile flocks, upon the reigning king, and upon the city itself. And then they wait. The god must be given ample time to consume the meal, not physically, of course, though the ancient texts are sometimes intriguingly ambiguous on this very point. Rather, the god consumes the essence of the food, the vital, divine force contained within it. After a suitable interval, precisely measured by ancient water clocks or by the chanting of specific ritual formulas, the priests return. They reverently remove the offerings. The food, now blessed by its sacred contact with the divine, is imbued with potent, sacred power. And because the gods, in their true forms, are incorporeal and cannot physically partake of earthly food in the same way humans do, these blessed offerings become the rightful property of the priests. They will partake of what the god has touched, absorbing some small, precious measure of divine grace with each sacred bite. It is an exquisitely practical system. The god is fed, the priests are sustained, and the cosmic order is thereby meticulously maintained. This profound ritual repeats in the evening, ensuring 2 meals a day, every single day, for as long as the city stands. Failure to perform this paramount duty is utterly unthinkable. To permit the god to go hungry is to invite immediate divine wrath, risking famine, devastating flood, or the visitation of other terrible disasters upon the entire populace. The priests know the ancient stories all too well. They remember what happened before the Great Flood, when humanity grew too noisy, too careless, too negligent in their worship. They are absolutely determined not to repeat that catastrophic mistake. But feeding the god, for all its immense importance, is only the beginning of the day's sacred duties. Throughout the morning, a continuous stream of worshippers begins to arrive at the outer courtyards of the temple, each bringing their own heartfelt offerings. A farmer arrives with a precious lamb, the firstborn of his flock. A wealthy merchant approaches with a bolt of exquisite fine linen from distant Egypt. A humble widow brings a small clay jar of honey, all she can possibly afford, hoping that the mighty Enlil will notice her devotion and, in his divine compassion, ease her profound suffering. The outer priests meticulously receive these offerings, carefully recording each one on clay tablets before conveying them into the temple's deeper, sacred chambers. Nothing is overlooked. Every sheep, every jar of honey, every precious coin is accounted for with precise detail. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur, therefore, functioned as far more than just a religious institution. It was an economic powerhouse. This colossal enterprise owned thousands of acres of fertile farmland, tilled by tenant farmers who paid a significant portion of their harvest as rent. It managed vast herds of livestock, cared for by shepherds employed directly by the temple. The temple complex also operated its own breweries, bakeries, and textile workshops, producing goods essential to daily life. Furthermore, it extended loans to merchants and farmers, accumulating considerable wealth through interest, a testament to its sophisticated financial dealings. By some historical estimates, the major temples in Sumerian cities controlled as much as a third of the entire city's wealth. All this extensive economic activity was rooted in a singular, foundational principle. It all belonged to the god. The priests saw themselves not as owners, but as mere stewards, managing the divine estate on Enlil's behalf. Indeed, the temple complex was a small city within the city, teeming with life and activity. Hundreds of people lived and worked within its hallowed walls. At the apex were the high priests, the chief administrators who were believed to commune directly with the god, interpreting his divine will for the community. Below them were the common priests, who diligently performed the daily rituals, maintained the sacred altars, and ensured that the purifying incense never ceased to burn. The temple also employed musicians, both men and women, who brought forth melodious sounds from harps, lyres, and drums during ceremonies. Archaeological records from Lagash even speak of an astonishing 62 lamentation priests accompanied by 180 vocalists and instrumentalists. One can only imagine the powerful sound of such a massive choir, their voices and instruments blending in complex harmonies, believed to soothe the god's troubled heart, especially when disaster loomed over the land. Then there were the scribes, the diligent record keepers, often young men who had spent years in the demanding temple schools, mastering the intricately complex cuneiform script. They would sit cross-legged in the cool shade of the temple walls, pressing their reed styluses into wet clay, meticulously recording every detail. How much grain arrived from the southern fields, how many lambs were sacrificed that month, which merchant borrowed silver and pledged its repayment by harvest time. These humble clay tablets, tens of thousands of them unearthed over centuries, are the invaluable reason we know so much about ancient Sumerian life. They were not literature in the modern sense but were rather receipts, inventories, legal documents, the mundane, yet essential paperwork of a functioning theocratic state. The temple also housed a host of skilled craftsmen, goldsmiths who fashioned exquisite ornaments for the god's statue, stone carvers who maintained and repaired the temple's many sculptures, and weavers who not only created the god's ceremonial clothing but also intricate curtains, carpets, and grand banners for festivals. Cooks, bakers, and brewers labored in the temple kitchens, preparing elaborate meals for the god's daily sustenance and grand feasts for major festivals. Servants and slaves, often prisoners captured in the endless warfare between rival city-states, performed the backbreaking labor of hauling water, cleaning the courtyards, and carrying supplies throughout the vast complex. And then there were the priestesses, particularly the high priestess, women of noble birth who served as the god's divine consorts. The most famous of these was the priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. She resided in a special, secluded residence known as the Jaipar, a cloister nestled within the temple complex. Symbolically married to the god, she was forbidden from marrying a mortal man. Her life was a devotion to ritual and prayer, dedicated to maintaining the sacred connection between the divine and the earthly realms. Some ancient texts even allude to a profound ritual called the sacred marriage, where the priestess and the king would perform a ceremonial union, representing the marriage of the goddess Inanna to the shepherd god Dumuzi, thereby ensuring the fertility of the land. Whether this was purely symbolic or involved an actual physical union, *Kairos Gamos*, remains a subject of intense scholarly debate, but the ritual's immense importance was unquestionably central to Sumerian belief. Beyond its religious and economic functions, the temple was also a pivotal center of learning. Within the Adubba, literally tablet house or school, young boys from wealthy families came to master the scribal arts. The curriculum was exceptionally demanding. First, they learned the hundreds of cuneiform signs, each one painstakingly copied onto practice tablets until their hands were steady and their strokes flawless. Then came mathematics, based on the sophisticated base 60 system, which allowed them to precisely calculate areas of fields, volumes of grain storage, and even compound interest on loans. They delved into the literary classics, copying out portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and hymns to various gods. Crucially, they also learned the intricate legal formulas required to draw up contracts and settle disputes. The teachers themselves, scribes of long experience, were notoriously strict. Beatings for sloppy work were a routine part of the day. Students toiled from dawn until dusk, their fingers cramping from gripping the stylus, their eyes straining to read the tiny, wedge-shaped marks by flickering lamplight. But the reward for such arduous dedication was immense. A trained scribe could find employment virtually anywhere, in the royal palace, managing the king's vast correspondence, in the temple, meticulously keeping the divine accounts, or in the bustling marketplace, drafting contracts for merchants. Literacy was power, and only a tiny, privileged fraction of the population possessed it. As midday approached, the heat became utterly oppressive. Sumerian summers were brutal, the sun beating down mercilessly on the mud brick buildings. The temple courtyards would empty as people sought desperately for shade. Yet the sacred work never ceased. In the innermost sanctuaries, priests continued the endless round of rituals. Incense had to be burned at prescribed intervals, sacred lamps refilled with precious oil, and the god statue attended to, kept clean, kept beautiful, kept eternally honored. Every moment of every day, someone was performing some act of worship, for the connection to the divine could not be allowed to lapse, not even for an instant. In the evening, the cycle repeated. The god was served his second meal, offerings were presented, and ancient prayers were chanted. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the city, came the most intimate ritual of all. The god had to be put to bed. The priests would approach the sanctuary once more, carefully removing the god's day garments and dressing him in night clothes. They would then escort the statue, or the divine essence it contained, to a special bed chamber at the very top of the ziggurat. This elevated chamber, exposed directly to the stars, was where the god was believed to spend the night. Some texts even suggest that the god's wife, his divine consort, would join him there. The cosmos itself was imagined as a grand household, with the god and goddess retiring to their private quarters while their loyal servants, humanity, rested in the courtyards below. With the gods settled, the temple complex was closed for the night. Guards took up positions at the gates, ensuring security. Yet, one sacred flame continued to burn. The eternal fire in the central brazier, tended by priests working in shifts, ensuring it never went out. To let the sacred fire die would have been a dire omen of doom. The smoke rising continuously from that flame was a constant, visible signal to the heavens. Here, it proclaimed, is a place where the gods are remembered. Here is a place where humans still serve. Here, the sacred covenant between heaven and earth endures. This was the unwavering rhythm of post-flood Sumerian religious life. Day after day, year after year, century after century. The rituals themselves rarely changed, or rather, they changed only glacially, with each generation adding subtle refinements, reinterpreting ancient texts, and consulting the accumulated wisdom of the past. The priests saw themselves as guardians of a tradition that stretched back to the very moment when kingship first descended from heaven, and civilization began anew. But the temples were not solely focused on daily rituals. Throughout the year, the cities celebrated grand festivals, and it was during these festivals that the cosmic drama of the gods was dramatically reenacted in spectacular public ceremonies. The most important of these was the Akitu, the New Year festival, celebrated in both spring, when the barley was planted, and fall, when it was harvested. This monumental festival lasted a full 12 days and involved the entire city. On the first day, the high priest would rise before dawn and recite a powerful prayer to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon in later periods. Though in earlier Sumerian times, this role belonged to different city gods. The prayer recounted the creation of the world, the epic battle against chaos, and the triumphant establishment of cosmic order. It served as a potent reminder that the cosmos was always under threat, that the forces of chaos were ever pressing in, and that only through constant vigilance and proper worship could order be maintained. On the fourth day, the entire Enuma Elish creation epic was recited, every word and every line taking hours to complete. The people listened reverently, standing in the temple courtyards as the awe-inspiring story of how Marduk defeated the primordial goddess Tiamat and created the world from her corpse was told once again. This was not mere entertainment. This was cosmic maintenance. By reciting the story, by remembering it collectively, the people believed they actively helped to keep the world stable. The myth was not something that had happened once long ago. It was something that had to be continually reenacted, continually retold, lest the world slip back into primeval chaos. On the fifth day came a dramatic and symbolic reversal of power. The king himself was brought to the temple. He was stripped of his royal regalia, his crown removed, and his scepter taken away. The high priest would then slap him across the face, pull his ears, and force him to kneel before the statue of the god. The king was compelled to recite a negative confession, declaring that he had not sinned, that he had not neglected the city, and that he had ruled justly. The priest then restored the king's crown and solemnly declared that the god had renewed his mandate. This ritual humiliation served multiple profound purposes. It reminded the king that his immense power originated from the gods, not from himself. It reassured the populace that their ruler had been judged and found worthy, and it provided a ritualized moment where the social order was inverted, where even the highest human authority had to bow in ultimate humility before the divine. On the eighth day, the statues of the gods from neighboring cities were ceremoniously brought to Babylon or Nippur, or whichever city was hosting the festival. These sacred statues, each embodying a different deity, were carried in solemn procession through the city streets. The people would line the roads, throwing flowers, singing hymns, and sometimes weeping with fervent religious emotion. "The gods have come to visit," they would exclaim. "The divine council is assembling." This was understood as the earthly reflection of a cosmic meeting where the fates for the coming year would be decreed. On the 11th day came the central mystery, the sacred marriage. In its most elaborate version, the king would take on the role of the god Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and the end priestess would embody Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. They would then enter a special, secluded chamber within the temple. What transpired there was never explicitly described in the ancient texts, but the symbolism was profoundly clear. The union of god and goddess was believed to ensure the fertility of the land. When they emerged, it was believed that the crops would grow abundantly, the flocks would multiply, and the city would prosper. Some scholars believe this ritual was purely symbolic, enacted in words and gestures, while others point to more explicit texts from later periods and suggest that the sacred marriage involved actual sexual intercourse, a hieros gamos, a holy union that collapsed the boundary between heaven and earth for a single, transcendent moment. The festival majestically concluded on the 12th day with widespread feasting and joyous celebration. The gates of the temple storehouses were thrown open, and abundant food was distributed to the people. Beer flowed freely, musicians played in the streets, and there was dancing, laughter, and a pervasive sense of renewal. The cosmic order had been reaffirmed, the gods had blessed the king, and the coming year would be prosperous, at least until the next crisis, the next drought, the next war, the next moment when the people would once again have to turn to the temples and beg the gods for their divine mercy. These festivals were not merely optional cultural events. They were considered essential to the very functioning of the universe. The Sumerians firmly believed that the world existed in a state of constant, precarious tension between order and chaos. The gods had indeed established order, the divine decrees that kept everything in its proper place. But that order was inherently fragile. It required constant maintenance, reinforcement, and unwavering attention. The rituals, therefore, were not symbolic acts of piety. They were real, vital work, cosmic labor, as necessary and demanding as plowing a field or repairing a crucial irrigation canal. Without these rituals, the Sumerians believed, the world itself would inevitably collapse. This profound worldview permeated every single aspect of Sumerian life. One could not simply do as one pleased. There were right ways and wrong ways to do everything, and the right ways were ultimately determined by the gods through the me. There were proper days for planting and improper days, foods that could be eaten on some days but not others, and specific rituals that had to be performed before beginning any significant task, whether that task was building a house, digging a well, or embarking on a war. The people lived in a constant, acute awareness of the divine presence. When a fierce storm rolled in from the desert, that was Enlil, the storm god, announcing his awesome presence. When the rivers flooded, that was the decision of Enki or Ea, who controlled the Abzu, the subterranean waters. When a woman became pregnant, that was the benevolent gift of Ninhursag or Nintu, the mother goddess. When a child died of fever, that was the tragic work of Namtar, the demon of disease, sent perhaps because a ritual had been neglected or a taboo violated. Nothing happened by accident. Everything was intimately connected to the vast, intricate web of divine will. And yet, for all this pervasive cosmic supervision, the Sumerians did not live in a state of cowering fear. Instead, they actively negotiated with their gods. They bargained, and surprisingly, they even complained. The prayers preserved on clay tablets are remarkably human in their tone. A man whose business had failed would not simply accept it as divine judgment. He would passionately argue his case before the deity. "I have always been faithful," he would declare. "I have brought my offerings. I have performed the rituals. Why have you abandoned me?" There is an astonishing intimacy in these prayers, a palpable sense that the gods, despite their immense power, were still in some fundamental way relatable beings. They could be flattered, persuaded, reminded of past favors, and even gently scolded for perceived neglect. This was the complex world the Anunnaki had created and rebuilt after the Great Flood. A world where humanity and divinity existed in constant, intricate interaction. A world where the line between the two was very real, yet remarkably permeable. Where humans served the gods, yes, but where the gods also needed humans, needed their offerings, their prayers, the smoke of their sacrifices rising into the heavens. It was a truly symbiotic relationship, and both parties understood they had obligations to uphold. But what of the ordinary people, those who were not priests or kings or scribes? What was life truly like for the farmer, the potter, the fisherman? The archaeological record offers us fascinating glimpses into their daily existence. Ordinary homes in Sumerian cities were typically built around central courtyards, providing both privacy and much-needed shade from the sun. The houses, like most structures, were made of sturdy mud brick, with flat roofs that often served as additional living space during the hot summer nights. Inside, there was remarkably little furniture by modern standards. People sat on woven mats on the floor and slept on reed mattresses. Storage jars lined the walls, containing precious grain, dried fish, dates, and beer. Most families maintained a small household shrine, a niche in the wall, where clay figurines of their personal gods were kept. These personal gods were not the great cosmic deities worshipped in the grand temples. They were cherished family guardians, spiritual protectors who watched over the household and interceded with the greater gods on the family's behalf. Every morning, the head of the household would say a brief prayer before this shrine, asking for protection, for health, and for success in the day's endeavors. Work largely defined life. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their fields, utilizing the sophisticated irrigation canals that crisscrossed the land. These vital canals were communal property, maintained by the entire city, and their upkeep was overseen by temple administrators. Failure to maintain the canals was a serious offense, as everyone depended on them for survival. The Instructions to a Farmer, a Sumerian agricultural text that has remarkably survived, reads much like a technical manual explaining in meticulous detail how to plow, when to irrigate, how to protect crops from birds, when to harvest, and how to thresh and winnow the grain. This essential knowledge, the Sumerians believed, had been given to them directly by Enki after the flood. It was divine wisdom, both practical and life-sustaining. Craftsmen worked in small workshops, often specializing in a single trade. Potters deftly shaped clay on their wheels, creating the storage jars, bowls, and cups that every household desperately needed. Metalworkers forged bronze tools and weapons, heating copper and tin in furnaces fueled by charcoal, then hammering the gleaming alloy into shape on stone anvils. Weavers operated massive looms, creating the textiles that clothed the population and also served as a major trade commodity. Jewelers carved intricate beads from carnelian and lapis lazuli, crafting the ornaments that adorned both the living and the honored dead. Women's lives, while largely circumscribed by their roles as wives and mothers, were not powerless. In Sumerian law, women could own property, engage in business, and even initiate divorce under certain circumstances. Wealthy women, especially those connected to the powerful temples, could wield considerable influence. The En priestesses, as we have seen, were figures of enormous religious and social significance. Even ordinary women actively participated in economic life, running market stalls, brewing beer commercially, and weaving textiles for sale. Children were often raised collectively, with extended families sharing child-rearing responsibilities. Boys from wealthy families might attend the prestigious scribal schools. Girls learned essential domestic skills from their mothers and aunts. All children, regardless of their social status, learned the stories of the gods, the myths of creation, the dramatic tale of the flood, and the paramount importance of maintaining a proper relationship with the divine. These stories were their history, their science, and their moral education, all rolled into one cohesive narrative. At the very bottom of Sumerian society were the slaves, often prisoners captured in the endless, brutal wars between city-states. Their lives were undoubtedly hard, but not necessarily short. Slaves could sometimes purchase their freedom, could marry, and in rare cases, could even rise to positions of responsibility as overseers or skilled craftsmen. The institution of slavery was accepted without question. It was simply part of the cosmic order established by the gods, as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. This, then, is the civilization the Anunnaki rebuilt after the flood. Complex, sophisticated, deeply religious, and intensely hierarchical. It was a civilization that masterfully balanced cosmic dread with everyday pragmatism, that saw the divine in everything while simultaneously developing advanced legal systems, intricate irrigation networks, extensive international trade, rich literature, compelling art, and sophisticated mathematics. They built a world that worked, that could sustain itself, that could effectively pass on knowledge from generation to generation. They built a world that would endure for thousands of years, profoundly influencing every subsequent civilization that came after. And then, as we have noted, the gods began their slow, gradual withdrawal. The direct appearances stopped. The clear, immediate instructions faded into memory. The temples continued to function, and the rituals continued to be performed with unwavering devotion. But the pervasive sense of immediate divine presence, that visceral feeling that the gods were right there, watching, guiding, intervening, that profound sense slowly diminished. The Anunnaki, having set the grand machine of civilization in motion, seemed to step back to merely observe it run. We, their descendants, built empires. We wrote new epics. We developed new technologies and explored entirely new ideas. We carried forward the fundamental knowledge they had given us, adding to it, transforming it, and ultimately making it our own. And all the while, buried beneath the shifting sands of modern Iraq and Syria, the ancient tablets waited. The oldest stories waited. The memory of what had truly happened after the flood waited patiently until a young British museum assistant named George Smith, hunched over a seemingly insignificant fragment of clay in a dusty archive room, suddenly realized the extraordinary significance of what he was reading. It waited until the academic world had to confront the astonishing fact that the biblical flood narrative had an older, far more complex origin. It waited until we had to grapple with the profound possibility that our ancient ancestors were trying to tell us something incredibly important, something we had long forgotten. The moment of Smith's discovery in 1872 was itself dramatic. He was diligently translating fragments from the vast library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, tablets that had been painstakingly excavated from the ruins of Nineveh and shipped to the British Museum. As he worked through one particular tablet, part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he realized with a jolt that he was reading a flood story. A story of a man warned by a god to build a massive boat. A story of animals taken aboard. A story of a dove and a raven sent out to find dry land. A story that predated the biblical narrative by more than 1,000 years. Legend has it that Smith became so utterly excited that he began to dance uncontrollably around the room. And then, overcome with emotion, he started to remove his clothing. Whether this last vivid detail is apocryphal or not, his excitement was undeniably real and entirely justified. He had found incontrovertible proof that the biblical narrative had ancient roots, that the stories of Genesis were not unique revelations, but rather drew upon far older, deeper traditions. When he presented his groundbreaking findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, the announcement made international headlines, capturing the world's imagination. The British Prime Minister himself reportedly attended Smith's lectures. The story of Gilgamesh's flood survivor, Utnapishtim, became an overnight sensation. But Smith's discovery was only the beginning. As more tablets were translated, as the full, awe-inspiring scope of Sumerian and Babylonian literature emerged, scholars realized they were looking at an entire lost world of thought and belief. They were reading the actual living words of people who had existed for 1,000 years ago. People who were striving desperately to explain their origins, their purpose, and their intricate relationship with forces they could barely comprehend, let alone control. And those people consistently and insistently credited everything they had achieved to the gods who had come down after the flood and taught them how to rebuild. The modern debate over how to interpret these profoundly ancient texts continues fiercely to this day. Are they pure mythology, the imaginative attempts of primitive people to make sense of their complex world? Are they perhaps garbled, distant memories of real historical events, such as devastating catastrophes, mass migrations, and encounters with genuinely advanced knowledge? Or are they, as the most radical theorists boldly suggest, literal accounts of extraterrestrial intervention or contact with a lost, highly advanced human civilization? Each new generation of scholars approaches these enduring tablets with fresh tools, new perspectives, and pressing new questions. And the tablets themselves, patient and remarkably enduring, continue to yield fascinating new insights. What we can say with absolute certainty is that the Sumerian account of post-flood reconstruction describes a systematic, highly organized effort, a testament to an extraordinary beginning. Cities were not founded randomly, but according to a meticulous plan. First, the sacred center was established. Then the 4 pre-flood cities were meticulously rebuilt and repopulated. Subsequently, new cities spread northward, each endowed with its own patron deity, its own magnificent temple, and a distinct role within the larger, interconnected economic and religious network. Knowledge, it is said, was not rediscovered haphazardly through trial and error, but rather distributed deliberately and systematically. Those divine decrees governing civilization, were bestowed by the gods themselves. Kingship, too, was lowered from heaven, establishing a social order aligned with divine will. Whether this sophisticated system was literally engineered by gods or extraterrestrial beings, whether it emerged from the survivors of an earlier, advanced civilization meticulously passing on their knowledge, or whether it simply developed naturally as human societies painstakingly recovered from a catastrophic flood and subsequently mythologized their own remarkable achievements, the ultimate result was undeniably the same. Within an astonishingly brief period, southern Mesopotamia transformed from scattered, flood-ravaged settlements into a dynamic network of thriving city-states. These burgeoning centers boasted the invention of writing, a codified system of law, monumental architecture that touched the sky, complex religious institutions, and sophisticated agricultural and economic systems that ensured their prosperity. The very blueprint for civilization itself was meticulously established in those pivotal first post-flood centuries. Everything that followed, from the grandeur of Babylon to the might of Rome, and indeed, to the complexities of the modern world, built upon that enduring foundation. The ancient tablets eloquently reveal what the Anunnaki did after the deluge. They meticulously rebuilt, patiently taught, wisely guided, and firmly established the foundational pillars upon which all subsequent civilizations would inevitably be constructed. And then, when their profound work was complete, they departed, leaving humanity with a gift far more valuable than gold, more enduring than the grandest temple. They left us with the profound memory of our origins, meticulously recorded in the world's oldest writing, patiently awaiting the day when we would be ready to read it again and dare to ask the deepest, most fundamental questions. Who made us? Why are we here? Are we truly alone in the vast expanse of the universe? And if we are not alone, if there are others out there, beings who once walked among us, taught us, and then vanished, what might they think of us now? Would they look upon our towering achievements with pride? Or would they be disheartened by what we have destroyed? Would they still recognize us as the same species they once called their workers, their servants, their children? The tablets, of course, do not provide answers to these profound questions. They cannot peer into the veiled future, but they faithfully preserve the past. And in that invaluable preservation, they offer us a profound mirror reflecting our origins. They show us precisely where we came from. They reveal the extraordinary moment when civilization began not just once, but twice. They vividly depict the terrifying catastrophe that nearly obliterated us. And crucially, they illustrate the assistance we received to rise again. Whether that aid truly came from divine beings, from extraterrestrial visitors, from other human survivors, or solely from the resilient ingenuity of our own species, the overarching story remains powerfully consistent. We were struck down. We picked ourselves back up. We built. We remembered. And in doing so, we became who we are today, the direct descendants of the first people to press words into clay, the inheritors of a monumental legacy that stretches back 6,000 years to the muddy shores of the very first cities that rose after the Great Flood. The Anunnaki's work after the deluge was far more than mere reconstruction. It was a profound reimagining of what humanity could aspire to be. And in a very real, tangible sense, we are still living within the world they helped to build. Our sprawling cities, our intricate laws, our very act of writing, and even our fundamental sense of time itself. All of it traces back to those initial post-flood settlements in Sumer. The enduring shadow of the ziggurat, the distant echo of the flood, the potent memory of gods who once walked the earth. These profound elements are intricately woven into the deepest, most foundational fabric of our civilization. And now, as you lie here in the encompassing darkness, your breathing slow and steady, your mind gently drifting between the realms of sleep and waking, you carry within you this ancient, profound knowledge. You know what the tablets proclaim. You understand what the oldest written words on earth tell us about our shared past. Whether you choose to believe them literally, whether you interpret them as powerful myth and illuminating metaphor, or whether you find yourself somewhere in the uncertain middle, you can no longer unhear what they whisper across the millennia. We were made. We were destroyed. We were saved. We were taught. We were given a second chance. And we took it. The rest, as the old saying goes, is history. But what an extraordinary history it is. And what an astonishing beginning. The tablets now reside in museums, safely ensconced behind glass. Their ancient clay surfaces are indelibly marked with the delicate, wedge-shaped impressions left by reeds, pressed by hands that turned to dust thousands of years ago. Yet, the words endure, the stories persist, the profound questions remain. And somewhere, perhaps, the Anunnaki themselves also remain, watching, waiting, wondering if the species they either created or discovered, the workers they patiently taught, or the children they carefully raised, have finally matured enough to seek them out again. To ask them, face to face, what they truly did after the flood. To hear the answer not from silent clay, but from living, resonant voices. Until that day, if it ever truly comes, we possess the tablets. We have the stories. We hold the memory, painstakingly preserved in the oldest writing on earth. And we have the cities they helped us build layer upon layer, rising steadfastly from the primal mud, reaching ambitiously toward the heavens, just as the very first ziggurat did in ancient Eridu, when kingship descended from heaven and the world gloriously began anew. Rest now. Let these ancient, resonant stories gently settle into your mind, like fine sediment in still, clear water. Let the faint, distant voices of the scribes who painstakingly scratched these tales into wet clay slowly fade into the background hum of deep, immeasurable time. The Anunnaki's work is finished. Your work, the simple, essential work of sleep, of rest, of profound renewal, now commences. Civilization can patiently wait until morning. History can wait. The deepest questions can wait. Close your eyes, breathe slowly and deeply, and allow your mind to drift back through the myriad centuries. Drift past the grandeur of the Persians, the might of the Babylonians, the power of the Akkadians. Drift past the third dynasty of Ur and the bustling early dynastic period. Drift past the very first instances of writing and the nascent first cities. Drift past the flood itself, all the way down to that singular, pivotal moment when the raging waters finally receded. The sun gloriously broke through the parting clouds, and a lone boat gently rested upon newly emerged ground. Zayusadra opens the window. The world is clean. The world is quiet. The world is utterly ready to begin again. And so, too, are you. Sleep well. The morning will assuredly come, as it always does. And with it, the world will be rebuilt again and again and again. By hands both human and, perhaps, divine. By knowledge both hard-earned and graciously given. By survivors who vividly remember, and by children who courageously dream. This is what the tablets meticulously tell us. This is what the Anunnaki truly did after the flood. They granted us the profound chance to start over. And we, remarkably, seized it. Now rest. The story has been told, the knowledge has been passed down, and the ancient clay, somewhere far away in a quiet museum archive, still faithfully holds its secrets, patiently waiting for the next person to ask, to wonder, to read the oldest words on earth, and to feel the immense weight of that tremendous gift. Civilization, knowledge, a second chance. Sweet dreams.